The relationship between faith and science has been a topic of interest for centuries. From Galileo's controversy with the Catholic Church to modern debates over evolution, it's clear that these two concepts have a long and complicated history. Today, we're still grappling with the question of whether faith and science can coexist harmoniously. Can they complement each other, or are they fundamentally at odds? I'm diving deep into a topic that's usually pretty controversial. Can faith and science really mix? Join me as I challenge myself to explore both sides and find some common ground. One of the biggest misconceptions about faith and science is that they are mutually exclusive. Many people assume that if you're religious, you must reject scientific evidence, and if you're a scientist, you must be an atheist. But this simply is not true. There are countless examples of scientists throughout history who have been driven by their faith to make groundbreaking discoveries. The problem is that we tend to focus on the loudest, most extreme voices on both sides, rather than seeking out common ground. This can lead to a kind of intellectual segregation, where people only listen to those who share their worldview. We need to recognize that faith and science are not competing teams, but rather two different ways of understanding the world. They can inform and enrich each other if we're willing to listen. Another misconception is that faith is somehow anti-intellectual, that it requires a rejection of reason and evidence. But many religious traditions place a high value on intellectual curiosity and critical thinking. What is often missed on the part of those claiming that having a religious perspective is a rejection of science and scientific evidence is differences in interpretation. Two people can look at the same evidence from different perspectives and come to radically different conclusions. You can even look at the same data from the perspective of two competing scientific theories and draw opposite conclusions. The problem is that those who claim that religion is a dismissal of science and scientific evidence are only capable of seeing the data from a single perspective. In this video on the religious side, we will focus on conservative Christianity, mainly because that is the perspective that I am most familiar with. For example, I cannot give you an accurate representation of a New Age Hindu perspective or a Muslim one. The other point that we need to deal with is what is meant by science. This is because there is a distinction between the methodology of science, the results of scientific research, officially accepted conclusions from research, and the established institutions of mainstream science. They are not the same. In general, the methodology of science refers to the scientific method. While it can include specific procedures in individual cases, when talking generally about scientific methodology, it is the scientific method that is being referred to. The results of scientific data consist of the actual data or observations made during scientific research. This does not include modeling or any other form of interpretation applied to the data. Officially accepted conclusions from research are the generally accepted interpretations of the raw data based on theory and modeling. The established institutions of mainstream science include mainstream educational research and publication institutions. Collectively, they are sometimes referred to as the scientific establishment. There is no conflict whatsoever between Christianity and the scientific method. In fact, the scientific method was developed from within a Christian worldview. Furthermore, despite claims to the contrary, young Earth creationists make use of the scientific method, producing several theories that have made successful predictions about future observations. In dynamic decay theory, Dr. Russell Humphreys started out with the idea that God originally created the Earth and other bodies in the universe out of water. Furthermore, it assumes that the magnetic fields were jump-started by aligning the magnetic fields of the individual water molecules, and that they had decayed since. If the magnetic fields had been above the dark blue line, the model would have been falsified. But not only are they all within the parameters required by this model, but it accurately predicted the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune before the Voyager 2 flyby. The margin of error on this graph for each of them was the result of uncertainty about the core of the planet. In another case, Dr. Russell Humphreys and others developed two models by which to predict the helium diffusion rates in zircon crystals. One was for the 1.5 billion years calculated by standard radiometric dating for the samples. The other assumed the samples were about 6,000 years old and that the Earth experienced one or more periods of accelerated nuclear decay. They then predicted the helium diffusion rate at various temperatures for each model. When the actual measurements were done, they fit the young Earth model perfectly. Despite claims to the contrary, there are no actual conflicts between Christianity and scientific data. The claims center around interpretations and not the actual data. Furthermore, they are frequently surprised when they discover data. They are frequently surprised by things that are either predicted by creationist models or at least more consistent with them than evolutionary models. A classical example of this is mitochondrial Eve. To the surprise of evolutionists, several years ago evidence was discovered that all human beings have a single common female ancestor. This was a surprise to evolutionists but predicted by creationists. Evolutionists dated her as living over 100,000 years ago by estimating the mutation rate based on the presupposition that we had common ancestors with chimpanzees about 5 to 6 million years ago. However, it turns out that when direct measurements are made, the mutation rate shows that she lived about 6,000 years ago, which fits the biblical account. Another example is that analysts of the human Y chromosome shows that all humans have a common male ancestor. Using the same approach, evolutionists dated him to hundreds of thousands of years ago. In this case, direct analysis of the mutation rate placed Y chromosome Adam at about 4,500 years ago, making him consistent with Noah rather than Adam, but still consistent with the biblical account. In still yet another example, we have unfossilized soft tissue and red blood cells found within dinosaur bones. This goes strongly against the idea that they are 65 million years old, but it would be totally expected they were just around 4,500 years old and buried in Noah's flood. Once again, this was a total surprise to evolutionists that is naturally explained from a creationist perspective, but that evolutionists cannot really explain. The entire point of this section is that there are no problems between Christianity and actual scientific data. If anything, objective analysis tends to support the biblical account. Evidence will show next the problem starts with how the data is interpreted, not the data itself. If either side is rejecting evidence, it is the evolutionary side. The problem between Christianity and science begins with the fact that officially accepted conclusions about data consequently be 100% naturalistic. This means that no conclusion or interpretation of the evidence that requires God or anything miraculous is allowed to even be considered. Consequently, the biblical account of history does not even have a chance because it contains two major supernatural events that had been dismissed by mainstream science for more than 200 years. In fact, theories most often used about the origin and geological history of the Earth were specifically developed by atheists and deists to get rid of the Genesis account. A primary assumption in these concepts is absolute naturalism, and it turns out that history, according to the Bible, contains two major supernatural events if they occurred would throw off any naturalistic interpretation of geology. These are creation and Noah's flood. If these events actually occurred and you tried dating the Earth based on totally naturalistic assumptions, you would naturally get a result many orders of magnitude older than it really would be. A good example is the standard 4.5 billion year, figure frequently cited for the age of the Earth. This figure is derived from an isochrone between selected Earth rocks and meteorites. It presupposes that the Earth naturalistically collapsed out of a cloud of dust and gas. The original paper even concedes that if the Earth formed another way, that could be any age younger than decided date. This word, by the way, includes 6,000 years. Consequently, the 4.5 billion year figure is an interpretation of data based on a theory that assumes the Bible is wrong about the origin of the Earth. The scientific establishment consists of the established institutions of mainstream science, include mainstream educational, research, and publication institutions. Collectively, They control what is officially called science and what concepts are accepted by the official scientific community. Ultimately, the number one issue between science and religion is the fact that the scientific establishment has totally excluded God from science. That has a result any evidence that would point to God's existence, or any theories based on God's existence, are excluded regardless of what the evidence actually says. This fact is extremely evident by the reaction to not just creation science, but intelligent design. The response to any hint of intelligent design is an almost religious fervor against it. Yes, there are ways for science and Christianity to live in harmony, but one or the other would have to change its behavior to accommodate the other. The two extremes are for one to give in to the other, but the more reasonable options would be to make allowances for perhaps religion within the context of science. For all practical purposes, this actually happened about 220 years ago at the beginning of the 19th century, when atheists and deists started claiming that the earth is older than 6,000 years. Most of the church bowed the knee, not wanting to be considered an intellectual, and even threw scriptural geologists of the time under the bus. First time, this is a bad solution because it requires reinterpreting the Bible to try to make it conform to theories that were designed under the presupposition that it was Rome. This is also a bad idea because scientists need to be free to follow the evidence where it leads them. However, this also includes being allowed to follow the evidence to God if the evidence leads to him. God should not be dismissed out of hand as he currently is. One simple solution would be for science to simply stay out of what are generally considered religious topics. This would include origins and even much of ancient history. By the way, because a naturalistic model of origins and history is fundamentally atheistic, it too is religious in nature. Even if you do not consider atheism to be a religion in and of itself, any view of origins and its subsequent history based on atheism has a religious nature to it. So maybe the solution is for science to simply stay out of such areas and stick to understanding how things work. Another simple solution is for scientists to simply be more open about the presupposition of absolute naturalism. Do not put on a pretext of objectivity that does not exist. Simply be open about the fact that everything you are saying assumed only natural forces and no involvement of God. The result of that is that someone who believes in God can understand where you are coming from and not be made to look like it is ignoramus for not agreeing. Once again, we need to have scientists stop pretending to be objective where they are not. The naturalism found in many areas of science, particularly origins, is anti-religious. Because of this, the results are an attack on religion. I've seen this done against the Bible repeatedly, where conclusions drawn based on the presupposition that the Bible was wrong are used to attack the Bible. Consequently, if your assumptions are anti-religious, be honest about it and do not be insulting to them if they reject your conclusion. Another solution is allowing the consideration of religious concepts, including the possibility of supernatural events as explanations within science. The only key is that it needs to be done in such a way that it can be tested. For example, if you are just saying we cannot explain it, it must be supernatural that would not qualify because there is no testability of such a broad concept. However, you can do the same thing with natural explanations by insisting on them regardless of the evidence. However, if you are specific enough that would produce effects on the world that can be measured so that it could be studied scientifically, then there is no reason to exclude such from science. The research mentioned earlier regarding accelerated nuclear decay and the helium diffusion rate in zircon crystals. This would be an example of a supernatural event, the accelerated nuclear decay, that would leave a measurable trace. It's something that could be checked scientifically and falsified if the data did not fit. In this case, the data did fit. The common claim against this is that you are just filling in what we do not know what God. First of all, you can do the same thing with naturalistic explanations by simply claiming that it occurred naturally without any actual explanation behind it. In such a case, you are simply filling in the unknown with an unknown naturalistic explanation. There are actually two ways that you can include God in science that does not qualify as a God of the gaps. The first one is simply concluding that the answer is God, based on what we do know, rather than what we do not know. This is a case where the situation strongly suggests God rather than a natural cause. The organized complexity of living systems and the immense improbability of them occurring naturalistically. As far as we know, such systems only result from the input of an intelligent designer. This is the basis of the concept known as intelligent design. This is not a God of the gaps, because we are not saying it had to be God, because we don't know how it happened, but we are saying that it had to be God, because such things do not happen apart from intelligent input. The other one involves starting with God performing a specific act that would leave specific consequences that we can measure and test. That dynamic decay of planetary magnetic fields is a perfect example of this because it can be falsified, and it predicted 2 planets' magnetic fields, Uranus and Neptune. This demonstrates that this theory fits the qualifications necessary to be considered scientific. This is particularly the case because the naturalistic model missed Uranus' magnetic field. The word faith has multiple meanings. The 3 primary ones are as follows: confidence or trust in a person or thing, belief that is not based on proof, belief in God or in the doctrines or teachings of religion. The primary one is based on knowledge of the person or thing in question, and you could have faith in such an area as you do not have direct proof, because you have evidence of their trustworthiness in other areas. There is also a difference between blind faith and informed faith. Blind faith can exist not only in the complete absence of evidence, but contrary to it. For example, when romantically in love with someone, it is possible to continue to have faith in them despite obvious evidence that they should not be trusted. Christianity, however, is an informed faith. Not only is it based on the written evidence of the Bible, but as you gain experience as a Christian, you get to see the faithfulness of Jesus Christ firsthand in your life. As stated before, blind faith is held to not only in the absence of evidence, but contrary to obvious evidence. This is more than somebody simply declaring a given position to be wrong, but the continued belief or trusting in someone or something in the presence of blatantly obvious evidence. For example, continuing to trust somebody who has repeatedly lied to you, and you are well aware of the fact that they have. When thinking about blind faith, it is common to equate that to religion, however. While some people do indeed have blind faith in their particular religion, it is not universal. Christianity, for example, encourages Christians to study and check the Bible rather than taking what a preacher says on blind faith. In fact, it is largely what are commonly called cults, where blind faith in leadership is actually encouraged, and often despite past failures. There are also people who have a blind faith in science. While in some cases this blind faith is in science's ability to solve the problems of the world, in most cases it is blind faith about finding and proving a naturalistic origin. For example, in such cases when you point out to the individual how improbable abiogenesis is, including the most reasonable odds against exceeding the number of possible events in the universe. The response shows blind faith in science either having a solution or being able to eventually find one. In no case are they ever able to produce an actual mechanism that overcomes the odds. They just assume it exists on totally blind faith. The same thing occurs when you present other evidence against abiogenesis being possible. They demonstrate blind faith that any problems with it will eventually be solved. In such cases, not only is there no evidence for this, but the evidence is actually to the contrary. As a result, such people show totally blind faith in an atheistic science. Despite claims by atheists that atheism is not a religion, the blind faith in atheistic science is definitely religious. This is evident by the fact that whenever either creation science or even simply intelligent design have entered into the picture, the reaction from these people has been one of religious zeal to silence the scientific heretics. This includes people losing their jobs in lawsuits. Ultimately, the blind faith in this type of science is a blind faith in experts. Furthermore, it is blind faith in people who become the experts by being approved of by the other pre-approved experts. This means that to qualify as an expert, you not only have to have the right degree from the right schools, but you have to agree with the other experts so that they approve of you being an expert. This excludes people who have learned to do independent study, educational institutes not pre-approved by the elites or disagree with them. This type of tyranny of the experts is exactly what existed under the dominance of the Catholic Church. They kept the Bible locked up in Latin so that the average person had to rely on the experts of the church, that is, the clergy, to tell them what it said. Naturally, to disagree with Catholic doctrine regardless of what the Bible said would get you in big trouble. This is exactly what we often see today in the official sciences, where unless you have the right degree from the right school and agree with the other experts, you are not part of the experts regardless of how much you have learned on the topic. One of the consequences of this type of blind faith in experts is that anyone who questions them is denounced. In this case, common terms such as anti-science or science denier are used. Furthermore, those who express blind faith in establishment experts will take anything they say has absolute truth, and nothing to the contrary will even be considered. Once again, this has a definite religious flavor to it. The word atheist simply means no God. At its heart, it is a rejection of the existence of God. Consequently, when the scientific community throws God out of consideration within science, it makes mainstream science an inherently atheistic endeavor. This not only allows atheists to have a sense of intellectual superiority, but it also makes the science of the mainstream scientific community, particularly with regards to origins, inherently unscientific. This is because a very important explanation is excluded before any data is ever looked at. That inherently goes against the scientific method. Excluding God as a possible answer creates desperation to find or salvage naturalistic models regardless of the evidence. In our own solar system, we have two major planets, Venus and Uranus, that rotate backwards. There is also a dwarf planet, Pluto, that also rotates backwards. The solutions most often proposed are not to question the models of how the solar system formed. It is assumed that they formed initially rotating the right way, but suffered a major collision that changed the rotation. There is, of course, no actual evidence, other than the fact that it is contrary to atheistic models. While it is true in this case that God could have created them any way he wanted, and that this too is untestable, and at least provides an alternative to now untestable naturalistic models. Furthermore, there is a model for planetary magnetic fields that not only is falsifiable, but has been successfully tested. What it can actually explain the off-center magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune, the strength of which it accurately predicted. These are two major feelings of the naturalistic dynamo theory, because the supernatural alternative is not allowed regardless of the evidence. There is the impression that is often given that anything claimed under the auspices of science by the scientific establishment is absolutely true. They need to be upfront about the fact that a lot of what they claim is based on existing theory and not necessarily objective truth. Such an admission would at least leave open room for disagreement based on disagreement with the theory. Ultimately, the scientific establishment cannot live in harmony with Christianity because they have already thrown out the supernatural in general and God specifically. They are in fact anti-theistic and not just atheistic. In fact, many of the attacks levied against Christianity are attacks against the possibility of supernatural miracles such as Jesus rising from the dead. The problem here is not Christianity and actual science, it is Christianity and the scientific establishment, and they are not the same thing. In general, the problem is one of worldview. You have a scientific establishment that is insisting on doing science from the perspective of an atheistic, naturalistic, materialistic worldview. It will inevitably run into conflicts with the supernatural and non-materialistic worldview such as Christianity. Actual science, meaning the scientific method, and actual data do not run afoul of the biblical account of history. It is when one demands that history be investigated on the presupposition of absolute naturalism that conflict is inevitable. As long as science is trying to understand how the universe generally works, then there are no problems. This is by definition going to be a natural phenomenon, and so naturalistic assumptions make sense. This is known as operational science, and it is best where scientists are trying to understand the functionality of the world and not necessarily its history. Because the biblical account of history not only includes supernatural events, but two major earth-shaping supernatural events conflict is inevitable to look at the word exclusively from an atheistic naturalistic perspective. One reason, as we have already discussed, is that if both biblical creation and Noah's flood occurred as described in the Bible, and you tried dating the earth by naturalistic assumptions, you would inevitably get a much older age than they actually would have. This is an inevitable result of the assumptions being used, and why there is a problem between the biblical account and atheistic models. It is also the primary reason why they cannot live in harmony. Science is primarily a systematic process for acquiring knowledge about the natural world. It relies on observation, experimentation, hypothesis testing, and rigorous analysis of evidence. Scientism is the belief that science is the only valid way to acquire knowledge, and that scientific methods can be applied to all areas of inquiry, including those traditionally belonging to philosophy, ethics, and the humanities. Part of the problem is that we are dealing with scientism rather than actual science. The minimum solution necessary for Christianity and the scientific establishment to live in harmony would be for them to stop claiming an exclusive right to science. Discourage the use of insults such as science denier or anti-science, and openly recognize the fact that people can look at the same data from different perspectives and see it in different ways. Stop ignoring the fact that most of their conclusions are just interpretations based on theory rather than independent evidence for that theory. Allow for alternative perspectives, including those that include the supernatural and God. In conclusion, science and Christianity are not mutually exclusive when you are referring through the scientific method and science for data. The problem comes into play with the scientific establishment excluding God and the supernatural and not admitting to the fact that a lot of the conclusions about history that disagree with the Bible extended from this one factor. It is important to realize that looking at the world from what is essentially a totally atheistic naturalistic perspective will inevitably run you afoul of the account in the Bible, regardless of which one is actually true. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think faith and science can coexist harmoniously, or do you see them as fundamentally at odds? Let me know, and suggest some other topics you'd like to see me explore in future videos. If you like this content, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Also, please help support this channel. See the description for details.